Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 13th chapter of Proverbs. And we divide the chapter itself is 25 verses. We divided it in the first 12 for reasons as we already explained in that one, because most of the Proverbs arranged after chapter 10, they carry no identifiable conceptual connection to its predecessor or successor. The first few words we're going to be covering today do have a flow and connect to each other. But one of the things we did in the previous lesson is we reviewed not words but themes from the 12th chapter. So what we did was we selected 10 verses which pertain to the proper use of language, and we briefly commented on that before we did the first 12 verses. What we're going to do here, the theme is wealth and poverty. So Solomon has a lot to say about a lot of things there are to even have anything to say with to begin with. And the one thing we want to establish before we comment on these, the one thing we should know in advance, is that all 25 verses of the 13th chapter are arranged in antithetically. So the common formula in Proverbs is an antithetical juxtaposition. It compares one thing to one thing, one outlook in one outcome to one opposite outlook in one opposite outcome. And what the antithesis is we're going to compare often here, not in every one. We have 5 verses to cover, is the antithesis between wealth and poverty. And the thing we need to communicate before we even comment on that is that Yahweh neither neither magnifies grace nor glorifies poverty. So the first verse is the second verse from the chapter we'll be covering today. For the fruit of a mouth a man eats good, but the desire of the treacherous is for violence. So we only need to comment on the first half of that verse. From the fruit of a mouth, that's where a man eats his good. He works the toil of his sweat and is entitled to eat what he has reaped and sown. So there is a process. It's not automatic. He did not, no one gave him the bread that he has to eat. He earned the bread, and as such he is entitled to eat it. Verse 4, the soul of the lazy one craves, but has not, while the beings of the hard workers are enriched. So the contrast is between a slothful one, a lazy one, who wants but doesn't want to work. So he craves even though he doesn't have the will or the desire or the inclination to earn, to pay for what he craves. Whereas those who are diligent are enriched. They work for what they have. They earn for what they own, and it's all a process of labor. There is one who makes himself rich, yet has none at all, and one who makes himself poor, yet has great riches. So the colloquial term for the first one is hood rich. These are the people who have fancy phones, fancy cars, but live in the ghetto, and they have, fancy clothes, so they look rich, even though they're actually not as poor as they appear. And anyone who's ever been to a college campus in the 21st century America has at least come across some guilt-stricken liberals who are so ashamed of the fact that they were born privileged that they feel duty-bound to masquerade as one of the poor. And the reason they're so indifferent to materialism is because they can afford to be. So the lesson from both of these is appearances is often deceptive. Things, how they seem, are very often not as they are. Wealth from vanity diminishes, but he who gathers by hand increases. So there's an implicit difference between wealth acquired through vain means, subterfuge, flattery, lies, quick wit schemes, and those who gather by his own hands increases because they work daily and diligently, so they have a steady foundation for earning, whereas wealth from vanity tends to disappear. It has wings of its own, which flies away, he says elsewhere in the proverb. So that being said, we're going to open with the 13th verse of this chapter, which marks the beginning of the actual official lesson. He who despises the word is destroyed, but he who fears the command is rewarded. So the antithetical contrast is from one who despises. The word and the command are synonymous and interchangeable. They both emanate from and spring from Yahweh, but the one who despises it is going to be destroyed. So they will be destroyed by not heeding the counsel and dictates and precepts that are outlined in this book. But he who fears the command, takes it seriously, not trivially, will be rewarded. So there is a reward for obedience. I know it stings initially, and it takes us beyond our comfort zone, but there is a reward for the trial and tribulation. So those may be hyperbolic terms, but the investment is worth the reward, shall we say. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, turning one away from the snares of death. So the law, those are the 5 books of Moses, collectively known by the Hebrews as the Torah, which translates into law. Another name for it is the Pentateuch, derived from the Greeks. Pente, pentagon. Penta is derivative of the number 5. So these are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And within those 5 books is a fountain of life. So that means not only life in itself, but a wellspring and a source of life. So it gives life to those he comes in contact with. And it diverts and advises and instructs and conditions the reader to avoid the ways of death, which are always inextricably rooted with sin. And there is a way that seems right unto a man, Proverbs 14:12. This is one of my favorite. But its end is the way of death. And he repeats that in 16:25. Good understanding gains favor, but the way of the treacherous is hard. So gaining good understanding, you don't just gain the favor, you have to gain the understanding. The process of acquiring knowledge is not automatic or that simple. It demands work and diligence and daily study and challenging oneself and being challenged by others to learn and expand upon the reservoir of knowledge you had yesterday to be wiser today than you were yesterday in order that you may live better tomorrow. But the way of the treacherous, they invite their own hardness, because by their very treachery they make not only the people's paths and the lives they come across a living hell, but also their own, incidentally, and rightly so. So the treacherous tend to sadistically delight in the torture of others, but the outstanding irony is they are punishing themselves, torturing themselves, often far worse than they are punishing others. Everyone with insight acts with knowledge, but a fool spreads folly. So the cause of having insight is that it will inform your actions and behavior. You will act knowledgeably and virtuously, and that is a result of having your insight. Insight is the intellectual ability to draw your own interpretations from certain facts. So you have personal insight on the matter, which by definition digs below the subterranean surface and brings it out to share with others. But a fool, by its very nature, they have nothing to spread but foolishness, because they are fools. And Solomon has a lot to say about fools. One of the favorite passages of the preceding chapter, the 23rd verse, a prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. And he says something similar throughout, even in the passage we'll be covering today. But the fundamental fact we learn is that folly or foolishness, by its very nature, is loud and self-promoting and self-aggrandizing. It has a pathological propensity to make its very foolishness known to everyone in the room, whereas the wise will give their word of wisdom at the appropriate occasion, and they will not cast their pearl before pigs in a room full of fools. A messenger that is wicked falls into evil, but a trustworthy envoy is healing. So in the pre-instant communication age, the ancient world, they couldn't, ship travel, even across the Mediterranean, was a lot more difficult than it was, such as, for instance, in the age of exploration. So one of the ways they were reliant, they had to physically transmit a message. There was no satellite in the sky to bring it instantly to somewhere who was at some other location on the earth. They had to physically rely on men by foot or horse who had to travel somewhere with the message. And Solomon, as a royal ruler, would have relied on this practice, and he compares and contrasts the wicked one who falls into evil. Because they are wicked, they invite their own evil. But a trustworthy envoy, that is the same thing as a messenger almost, or it is a guest, but they bring healing and redemption and reconciliation between parties. that wicked messengers divide and ultimately destroy and kill. Poverty and shame are for him who ignores discipline, but he who heeds reproof is esteemed. So the recipe for poverty, and some people may think that Solomon's economics are overly simplistic, but there is a principle here that if you ignore discipline, you're going to invite your own poverty, because you will not, in your youth, if you do not develop the traits which respond and adapt to the educative value and embrace the remedial potential of discipline, you're going to be ashamed and poor because you neglected to heed these vital, life-giving, life-building virtues. But he who heeds reproof, he who respects an honest critic, and one who is attentive, a critic to them for their own improvement, will be esteemed as a result of their attitude and embracement of criticism, which is a synonym for reproof. A desire accomplished is sweet to the soul, but to turn away from evil is an abomination to fools. So the first of these, we read that this is a self-evident statement. A dream fulfilled, or a desire accomplished, that is sweet to the soul. It brings nourishment, it brings healing, it brings health, it brings life to the soul when our will and plans and desires are accomplished. But, wicked people have a different mindset, and to them, an abomination. Now, when we typically think of abominations, we think of that which the Father decrees abominable, but the fools think that evil is an abomination. So that's a double negative there, two negatives: evil, abomination. They will think it is positive and embrace it, and to turn away or repent from their evil nature, evil course of action, evil orientation is abominable, and a price they're not willing to pay because they are foolish. He who walks with the wise shall be wise, but the companions of fools suffer evil. This reminds one of the slogan, "Show me your friends and I'll show you your future." So the fact is that people tend to gravitate around people they like and people they like to be like. So if you fall under the sway and influence of good people, you will surround yourself with them, and you will eschew the evil company which corrupts good manners, 1 Corinthians 15:33. But if you're foolish, you're going to gravitate around your own, and sinful people and born-again people have a mutual attraction to each other. We each recognize in ourselves, in our own, but it is possible for even the born-again to surround themselves with people and figure and characters of the old life. The evil people we used to affiliate with, and their influence is deadly and destructive and often deceptive because we have a sentimental attachment to our former friends. But our sentiment should not extend to their sin. We must love the sinner but hate the sin. But it is a delicate balancing act for the born-again believer in that scenario I just explained. Evil pursues sinners, but good is repaid to the righteous. Now, why would evil pursue sinners unless sinners didn't pursue evil? So they reap what they sow. They're in their own trap, their own vicious cycle of being pursued by the very evil that they are pursuing in their sin. So they take delight in sin. Sin is a source of satisfaction for a lot of people. And, the danger is when it becomes a rival satisfaction for the Christian, for their love of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. Then it becomes idolatry and false worship, and we can no longer call ourselves Christians because a Christian demands a totality and an exclusivity of worship. But good will be repaid to the righteous. So when we paying an act forward as opposing to we should pay back everyone who's given us a favor, but we should also pay acts forward, because if good has to start somewhere, why not with us? Why don't we be the ones to spread the seed of goodness that can spread and bring blessings? And this is a natural cause and effect of being blessed, is to be a blessing unto others. It's not enough for us to have and hoard the blessing. If we do that, we will lose it because it will diminish in us. Its existence demands that we spread it to others so that they too may be blessed as are we. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. So a careful, conscientious family man would regard his money righteously enough to provide and make provisions and arrangements, not only for their children, but their grandchildren. And Solomon certainly left all the wealth in the world to his successors, which gradually frittered away. And because they became sinners, his successors, eventually, there was a mixed cast of character. They were stored up not for the righteous, so I probably shouldn't have went where I just went, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. This is something Job agrees with in the book which bears his name. He says something similar to that effect. And now why? Because sinners, they're self-oriented creatures. They do not care about providing for anyone else other than their own. So they're not going to leave a will. They're not going to leave an inheritance. They're just going to do with their money, their ill-gotten, ill-gained, illicitly acquired money, whatever they deem fit, whatever works out for them, whatever serves their self-satisfaction and self-interest. They are completely incapable of not having an ulterior motive to having what they have. Much food is in the tillable ground of the poor, but a lack of justice sweeps it away. So this was a common dilemma of the rich exploiting the poor. The Mosaic Law, the Torah, of which you read in the 14th verse earlier in this lesson, explicitly commanded that the prosperous and the well-to-do of society have a concern for the weak, the oppressed, and the vulnerable, and not abuse and exploit them. Tragically, this wasn't the ideal, didn't always match the reality, and there's a whole host of social justice prophets, and I'm almost hesitant to use that word because of today's secular social warriors who are an aberration of what they claim to represent social justice. They're just grievance mongers and drama junkies. They need to seek their fix, so they're manufacturing artificially controversies to get excited about. And, they're just drama junkies. But there is such a thing as social justice, and there were social justice prophets. And Solomon, as a wealthy man, certainly had concern for the poor, but many in his position, or even at a less degree of his wealth, were not concerned. This was the fact which ultimately led to the nation of Judah and Israel before it being swept away, because they swept away the fruits of the poor man's toil. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him seeks him with discipline. So it's in fact an act of hate to not physically discipline your kids, and I think physical discipline gets a bum rap these days. It is seen as the end of the world with potentially irreversibly ruinous consequences to the child who is physically punished, but it is described as an act of love. To discipline. So we discipline our children because we love them, and with a rod if necessary. Now there is a more prevalent form of child abuse taking place in the United States of America right now, and that is the absurd infiltration of the LGBT agenda into our children's elementary school. No child is too young to be left off target for the confusion that they induce. So it's not just about homosexuality. Any sexuality at all is inappropriate to teach to 6 years old, but they're specifically and deliberately targeting the young, and that is a species of child abuse, because a child has the right, the first civil right of every child is to have his innocence intact, and these weirdos, these degenerates are coming through and spreading their sickness. Why? Because misery enjoys company. They want to bring everyone down to their own equal level of pathetic, and they are perhaps oblivious to the fact that they are instigating child abuse, and many of the same voices who support their depravity are the ones clamoring against child abuse or physical punishment to lovingly impart discipline and instruction and guidelines through which to live to one's child. The righteous eats to the satisfying of his soul, but the stomach of the wicked is lacking. Now, the thing we have to communicate often about Proverbs is these are not promises. These are principles. So, of course, many righteous go a-begging in the world, and the wicked flourish and prosper, not necessarily at the expense of the righteous, but often so. So it's more complex and less simplistic than saying that if you are righteous, you will automatically have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day for you and your family. That's not what this is promising. It's just establishing a principle that if one is righteous, they will be diligent in work. This assumes there are no external interferers from a righteous man being given the due diligence of his own work. He will be able to eat with his being. But the wicked, the lazy, the one who is as good at inventing excuses and to appropriate a proverb, which is a literary device, not unique to the Hebrew people. These proverbs are unique in that they are inspired, but a proverb is a pithy saying of condensed wisdom. And one of our own American Proverbs writers, Benjamin Franklin, said, "He who is good at making excuses is seldom good at or for anything else." So that's a fitting conclusion to this lesson. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.